Donald Trump's inauguration as President of the United States was unprecedented on many levels. Initially, it had been thought that large numbers of his supporters would show up to welcome their now crowned king and greet him in the style that he deserved. This didn't happen. In fact, the turnout at Trump's inauguration was relatively low, certainly much lower than that of Barack Obama before him. Secondly, the day after the inauguration, the United States witnessed some of the largest demonstrations since the anti-Iraq war demonstrations of 2003, this time led largely, almost exclusively by women, protesting against Trump's vulgar and offensive remarks against everyone, but against women in particular. The way in which sexist language was made part of the discourse. And women responded well to this, not too po-faced, not in a PC way. The favorite banner I saw said, "Trump, we're quite capable of grabbing our own pussies," which reflected the spirit of many years ago when the feminist movement was at its height. And the demonstrations were a huge success. They took place in the United States. And since what happens in the United States dominates the rest of the world, because it is the only empire still, there were supporting demonstrations in Britain, in other countries in Europe, and one or two even in Asia. So from the point of view of spoiling Trump's big day, these demonstrations were a big success. There's no doubt about it, and the mood was vibrant and vigorous. Yet, questions arise. What is the alternative to Trump in political terms? Because on the economic front, Trump is now doing what he promised to do, effectively protectionism. One of his first measures was to take the United States out of the Far Eastern treaties that he had been attacking during the campaign and was very critical of Obama for. The United States is no longer part of some of the globalization plans laid by his predecessor. If the same thing happens in terms of NAFTA, which Trump is pledging, then we will be into a period of full-blown protection. Now, the establishment media and the establishment politicians and their ideologues who attack this, attack it because for them globalization was the only alternative and is the only alternative. This group of political parties of the left and right center, their media allies, still refuse to accept that the system which they put into place and defended for the last 2 decades has imploded. The system that I defined as the extreme center. But the extreme center is refusing to die and is using figures like Trump to show, well, this is what happens if you discard us. But what they never are able to explain is why this has happened. It is a result of the economic collapse of 2008, which has resulted in growing social inequality. And if the truth be told, something that happens rarely these days, the basis for Trump's victory in the United States was laid by Obama's policies. Trump won the presidency. And for that, you can blame Hillary Clinton and an inept Democratic Party leadership. But Obama lost the Senate and the House of Representatives, so that the Republicans are now dominant in all three, led by a maverick president who no one thinks belongs to any party, even though he is the Republican president. So without the politics and economic policies being followed by Obama, this probably would not have happened. It's also possible that had the Democrats chosen a different combination of people to fight Trump, they still might have won. They had the worst of both worlds. But it's not only a question of Trump, or to imagine that this is now the fount of all evil. The Americans, including many of my friends, think that what happens in their own country is the most important thing in the world. Well, this is not the case for people who live elsewhere in the world. What Trump's predecessors did in the Middle East, in Africa, in South America, for them, for people who live in these countries, is every bit as important as anything that Trump has threatened to do to migrants, Muslims, and other minorities in his own country. Whether he'll do them remains to be seen. Clearly, there will be vigorous campaigning against him if he threatens to do so. But till now, the central thrust of Trump has been what he promised, which is protectionism to increase jobs, to bring back work to the United States. And let there be no doubt, whether we like it or not, if Trump succeeds in creating more jobs, if he succeeds in building a new infrastructure, which is collapsing in the United States, we're in uncharted waters, but if he succeeds, he will win again. So people had better be prepared for that. And he will win because he has done what he promised in terms of jobs, not guff like making America great again, which every president wants to do. I mean, there's nothing particularly fascist about that. It's old-fashioned American nationalism and chauvinism. But let's look now not just at the United States, but at what is happening in Europe too. Basically, there is a pattern which extends from the United States across the Atlantic to Europe and also affects or infects Asia, Africa, South America, etc. This is that the anti-systemic movements, which rose and developed in the 90s and were largely of the left, are now in a state of collapse or have ceased to exist or are in deep crisis. We know what is happening in South America. There is no point to repeat that. The crash of the oil prices affected the economies adversely, though they still struggle on, despite all the adversities. In Europe, we see divisions. We see anti-systemic forces existing, but in a very weak way. Now, if we say that neoliberalism is somehow separate from capitalism and that the destruction of neoliberalism is the key aim, but capitalism by itself is fine, if we say that, then we can say there's lots of anti-systemic forces. But in fact, of all the movements from the right, very few actually challenge the system as such. And those movements that exist on the left basically offer souped up, mild versions of old social democracy. So that is a problem. And the total collapse of the large traditional working class-based parties in Europe has created a vacuum. Now, even in the United States, Trump didn't have it all alone. From the left, a challenge was mounted by Bernie Sanders, which was defeated by his own party, not by Trump. In Britain, a challenge has been mounted by the left via Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. Of course, there is also UKIP, which would have dozens of members of the British Parliament if the system were not so blatantly rigged against proportional representation. So it's a situation which varies from country to country. Where the left doesn't exist at all, the right are very dominant. Or where the left has capitulated or been too close to the Social Democrats of the extreme center, there they have suffered as well. But if we look at the countries of Europe, the defeat of the Renzi referendum, which was designed to curtail and truncate Italian democratic institutions, was defeated. Even right-wing or liberal right-wing papers like The Economist were very nervous about the referendum. They were nervous that if Renzi's referendum won, the enormous powers that it gave the rulers of the country would be misused were the Five Star Movement to win. The Five Star Movement was strongly opposed to the referendum. So the defeat of the referendum in Italy was a huge defeat, politically and ideologically, for the extreme center, and Matteo Renzi had to resign as prime minister, not that he had ever been elected in the first place. The only countries in Europe which do not have an extreme right as such are Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and the reasons are interesting. In Ireland, you have never had a huge tradition of fascist politics of the far right. I mean, nationalism was the dominant current and remains so with Sinn Féin Popular or parties to the right of Sinn Féin. Where the challenges have come in Ireland, they have come from the far left and principled, open socialist groups who have been winning seats and will probably carry on doing so without being able to challenge the system as a whole, showing that dissent in Ireland from the system and systemic politics comes from the left. In Portugal, the group on the Left Bloc, is giving critical support to the government without joining it by not allowing the right to bring it down. In Spain, most of the far right, those that didn't die off, grouped themselves inside the PP, the Partido Popular, the Conservative Party in Spain. But in other parts of Europe, in France, where a general election is pending next year, you have a rise of the far right, represented by the Front National of Marine Le Pen, who is another figure, well to the left of Trump, by the way, who, when she was in the United States recently and asked which politician she identified with the most, she said Bernie Sanders, which surprised many people in the United States, but didn't surprise too many people in France, because her program includes strong elements of what the left has been arguing for traditionally in French politics, and this is what she does to win working-class voters, because the French extreme center parties don't do this any longer. And if Marine Le Pen gets 30% of the popular vote, she will probably be challenging either the conservative François Fillon, the most right-wing candidate that the conservatives could produce, or Tony Blair type called Macron, who is standing as an independent. The Socialist Party, whoever it elects, seems to be excluded from politics, though this could change. And on the left of the Socialist Party, there is the character of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who represents the left bloc. So in France, if you add left and right votes in the opinion polls, the right has a big majority. But there is a danger that at the last minute, Marine Le Pen might move forward. And this could be a Trump effect, that people not too ashamed now to vote for openly right-wing politicians. In Holland, Sweden, and Denmark, you have well-established parties of the right. In Holland, they've got a social program which is progressive, but are staunchly and in a crazy way hostile to Muslims and migrants in general. In Sweden and Denmark, the same thing. Whereas the economic crisis of 2008 created unrest, it also created a feeling, fanned by right-wing parties, that were it not for the migrants in our countries, all would be well. Well, all was not well even before there were migrants in the country. And the migrants they talk about are of two sorts. First, people who, according to the rules and regulations of the European Union, have the right to travel freely and seek jobs throughout the Union. There are many restrictions on them, by the way. It's not exactly a free movement of labor. It's only a free movement of labor if you find a job. In some countries, if you can't find a job, you're asked to return. And even within the EU, the anti-immigrant feeling was reflecting itself on the way governments were beginning to react. But that is the immigration they're talking about, is other Europeans from less well-off countries who seek jobs elsewhere. The second type of immigration, which has become the bogey person of the right-wing parties and increasingly extreme center governments, are the refugees. Now, whereas the traveling migrants are in search of jobs, they come, they work, often they go back, the refugees are in search of permanent homes because the homes that they had were bombed or destroyed or wiped out by the wars that the United States, under Bush, Obama, Clinton, have been waging till now. And I've, felt half satirically that with every new war that they make, they should put in and tell the people we're going to war to change the government in this country, and this could mean up to 250,000 refugees in your land. I doubt whether they'd get much support for these wars. But that is the result. Refugees rush to the countries which have made war on them, saying, you've made war, now it's your responsibility to look after us because we are the victims of your wars. And that has been the case with the Syrian refugees, who've become a huge football in European politics. In the most blatant way, in Germany, where Angela Merkel's initial response, generous, had to be withdrawn. She herself retracted it when she saw the impact it had in her own country. And Germany is, of course, the single most important country in Europe. At the moment, it is unlikely that the extreme center, the oldest extreme center in Europe, the Social Democratic Bloc with the Christian Democrats and their Bavarian sister party, the CSU, will be defeated. Together they are well ahead. Will the Social Democrats be tempted into what they call a red-red-green coalition, which would mean a coalition with the Greens and the Die Linke, the left party? I doubt it very much. Why should they be? They might even be the largest party, in which case they'd have the chancellorship. But nonetheless, the fact that Die Linke has been so closely linked on a governmental level, locally and in some Länder, some provinces of Germany, with the Social Democrats, has meant a draining of its support. And this failure of groups like Die Linke to understand this it might prove to be a disaster for them. Why? Because increasingly people feel that these center parties have lost confidence in their own people. They don't care. They're parties of the elite. Basically, they support the bankers and big business, and they make money at our expense. It's not such an irrational response, because that is what has been happening even in Germany. So the big debate now in Germany has shifted to the question of the refugees and indirectly to European immigration. Now, the German constitution, which is probably the most liberal in the world, created after the Second World War, till now, had guaranteed asylum to every asylum seeker fleeing from war, oppression, repression, whatever. No longer. The clause is still there, as far as I know, but in its actions, the German government can no longer hold to it because of the wars in the Middle East that have produced a rush of refugees. So the question of immigration has become the central issue of politics throughout Europe, and as we see in the United States. By the way, in the United States, Trump's predecessor, Barack Obama, had already deported a few million refugees from Mexico and South America. So there's nothing new. And the wall built in Texas is a wall that was begun long before Trump came to office. So it's worth remembering the continuity of politics as well as the shifts that are taking place now. In Germany, to return to this major European country for a moment, we have new parties like the AfD, which is a party set up by Social Democrat dissidents and which now campaigns exclusively on Germany for Germans. But you know, Germans include many people of Turkish origin who were born in Germany. But they claim, we're not talking about them, we're talking about the new refugees. But you know, no one quite believes this. It's an unpleasant atmosphere on this question. And within the left party, the most far left party in Germany, Die Linke, there is a big debate on this question, with Sarah Wagenknecht, the leader of the party, making some very dubious remarks on immigration, especially after the press blew up the events at Frankfurt Station when large numbers of young immigrant men manhandled women and misbehaved generally. So this is a question which isn't going to go away. And there are no easy answers to it. What do we do as far as the question of immigration is concerned? Well, those in the European Union will try and change the laws of the Union, but that will then offend the Eastern Europeans, from where the bulk of the migrant workers come. And I haven't even yet got to Eastern Europe, which is part now of the EU and the NATO system. Hungary and Poland has far-right governments. Viktor Orban in Hungary and Kaczynski in Poland. Orban is an open right-wing nationalist. Anti-Semitism is hardly hidden in Hungary. Casual anti-Semitism is there in action. Former Hungarian extreme right nationalists and semi-fascists are widely praised, especially the government of Admiral Horthy, the pre-war government. And the atmosphere is distinctly unpleasant. How long it will take to defeat Orban remains to be seen, but he will not be defeated simply by proposing a pro-globalization extreme center government. In Poland, Kaczynski was defeated on an important question when he tried to turn back the laws on abortion that have existed in Poland ever since the Second World War, when all the communist governments agreed that this was a basic right for women and for society at large, and abortion was free on demand. Restrictions have been placed on it, but attempts to restrict abortion further were defeated by a huge march by Polish women against these laws, after which the government retreated, no doubt under pressure from behind the scenes by the Germans, who are pretty dominant economically in Poland. So the nationalism that exists in these countries is there. I mean, they don't object to migration because it affects them. They don't object to immigrants. But were there any immigrants wanting to go there, or refugees from the Syria or other wars, they become just like everyone else. In Croatia, at the moment, there is a right-wing government linked to the wartime Ustashi, linked not in the sense that they are its direct heirs, but that they feel very closely tied up with that form of Croatian nationalism, which meant fighting with the Third Reich and the Nazis against your own partisan movement. And there was an interesting development recently in the town of Šibenik, where there's a literary festival each year, where just a few weeks ago, the government withdrew the funding from an exhibition telling the Anne Frank story on the grounds that this exhibition also contained friendly references to the Yugoslav partisans who had fought some of the German Wehrmacht to a standstill in the mountains of Yugoslavia. So with this degree of revisionism taking place, Europe is in a complete mess. And this is a mess which is self-created. What about the countries, the Western countries of the periphery? If you look at Australia, we have seen brutal right-wing politics carried out by both political parties, parties of the extreme center, for the last 2 decades. The politics have recently become disgusting with a war on refugees. I think the way refugees are treated in Australia borders on crimes against humanity. We have stories about torture, rape of children, rape of women carried out by people appointed by Australian governments. This is all not talked about in the polite media, which concentrates largely on fake news. They don't actually cover these stories. In the other country of the periphery, Canada, Harper's policies, which were classic neoliberal policies, privatization, huge increase in social inequalities, etc., have not been reversed by the Trudeau government at all. In fact, the Canadians are hoping to keep these policies as they try and balance between the United States and China, with both countries as trading partners. And Canadian politicians have been known to whisper in each other's ears that if climate change accelerates, Canada is one of the countries that will benefit because it will release a lot of land currently under snow. So it is a gloomy picture of the world that I have presented today, because it's better to be hard-headed and realistic. And while the resistance is very welcome, if the resistance in the United States in the shape of huge demonstrations is recuperated by the Democrats and their party structures on state and national level, then the question has to be asked, will it have been worth it, because we'll be back at square one. The big question is, for Europe to renew itself, it needs new political movements, new political forces, new political parties that challenge the system on every level. If it fails to do this, if the left is incapable of it, the right will, as they already have, step into the vacuum.